Everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Game Week 36 team selection. It's 3 game weeks left, and I've decided to make some very, very aggressive moves for this week. Not that I think they're necessarily the best moves that I could have made, but certainly the moves that I wanted to make in terms of differentiating my team from the rest of the field and to hopefully push into the top 1K for the first time this season. So the goal really was with my free transfers, I think, to finally use my team value at this juncture of the season and to kind of separate myself from the rest of the field. We'll talk about that in terms of my team later. We'll quickly review Game Week 35 and then discuss some of the data preview of this week in Game Week 36 and how I'm also using that to set my lineup as well. And then we'll just talk about, I think, general sort of macro topics in terms of transfers, and then we'll jump into my own team selection. So for Game Week 35, I actually ended up with only 50 points, but 50 points was more than good. The key decision for me was actually just playing Senesi over Semenyo. I felt pretty confident that Semenyo was not going to play too many minutes. As it turns out, I think the City kind of leaker or insider, I suppose, that we have within the FPL circle, FPL MCFC, did mention that Semenyo had probably actually missed the FA Cup game because he had a knock of some sort and I think was doing some recovery before actually ultimately training with the team in advance of Game Week 36. So I guess there were some rumors about Semenyo not in training, and obviously he wasn't photoed in all the training sessions, but we did see him eventually, before the deadline in one of the training sessions. So I think people weren't too worried about that in the end. I ultimately just wanted to bench Semenyo because I just felt like Senesi had a much better game on paper, and I did think that Palace were going to rotate quite massively. This was obvious with all the previous Palace rotation that we've seen anyway so far. There were a couple of things that flopped within the week in terms of Strauch, in terms of O'Reilly, in terms of Cole Palmer again. He's had a very poor season, but I think taking a step back, you just kind of have to say there is still a lot of value in someone who does take penalties at the end of the day. We've seen Cole Palmer miss penalties. That hasn't taken away from taking penalties. So the inherent value of just being a penalty taker is always there. I mean, we have owned Bruno this season twice for 2 penalty misses as well. And you can't feel too bad about it because at the end of the day, that is representative of future value, usually with a player, right? As long as that team is also able to continue to draw penalties going forward. So that's kind of my view on Palmer. As far as, let's say, Gabriel, I think some people actually kept, the core of Senesi and Hill. And if I'm being honest, we've lost a lot of points to people who have Senesi and Hill. Equally, a lot of points to people who have Pascal Gross, who are going to enjoy this weekend versus Wolves at home, whilst I've had Enzo as a transfer in. And it has been a little bit of a transfer I've regretted just because of I guess, what sort of dawned on me is that, I no longer really want too many Chelsea players, and I have to make a decision between either Enzo or Palmer this week. And probably if I thought a little bit harder a few weeks ago, that could have been something that was likely. And maybe the Mitoma transfer could have just been held off, not because there wasn't an advantage, I think, to moving Mitoma to Enzo. It could have been very much the case that Mitoma was benched twice, if not for the Diego Gomez injury, but just the idea that if I was sort of pre-booking a transfer anyways for Mitoma, that really should have been a player that I was 100% comfortable keeping for the rest of the season. And if I'm at this juncture where I'm choosing between Enzo and Palmer this week, then I've probably, made too aggressive potentially of a transfer. As far as the front line, just nice to see Calvert-Lewin score a goal. And João Pedro, that was a wonderful goal. He actually had plenty of chances to get points. I mean, all the Chelsea players did. Obviously, Cole Palmer with the penalty, Enzo with the shot that hit the post, which would have been a João Pedro assist, and then João Pedro with the disallowed goal plus the actual goal. With Tavernier, he only had 1 shot on target versus Palace, but it actually was a 1-on-1. I think it was just because he's more right-footed as a player, didn't really have enough of an angle to actually kind of curl it around the goalkeeper, so he pretty much hits it straight at Petrovic. It was a poor shot. And Tavernier's been an interesting player because if we look at his season-long underlying stats, he's probably been one of the players at that sort of price point that has clearly been far ahead of his peers in terms of open play. So something I mentioned within the cheat sheet itself is that actually, if you price, for example, Tavernier against all the other sort of 5.x mids within the game, he simply is the player with the best NPXG per 90. So even though he's lost penalties to Krupi, which is 100% confirmed now with that additional penalty take, I think, by Krupi. The advantage, I suppose, to Tavernier is, first of all, he's on half of the set pieces. And then second of all, he simply had really, really good NPXG per 90. But he is a player that I guess flatters to deceive. At the same time, I think if you look at Tavernier historically, he's actually one of the worst finishers we have, remaining within the league. This is actually, ironically, something that Bournemouth had in spades. They had Dango, Tavernier, and that's kind of a pretty big concentration of underperformers in terms of finishing. I think Tavernier this season has been somewhere around, minus 2.83 in terms of the total XG that he's been able to accumulate and convert. So he's only scored the 6 goals this season compared to around 9 XG. And that's very similar to a season last year where he only scored 3 goals from around 6 point something. So yeah, I am a little bit low in Tavernier, but it doesn't mean that I sell him this week. If anything, I sell him in future weeks, but it's something to think about in terms of decision making going forwards, and then also just kind of reflecting on himself as a player. But not too many regrets in terms of owning him over this period. He still managed to get a goal in the double, so it is what it is. As far as Burnley, it's just unfortunate. I think, just generally speaking, Leeds pretty much gave one chance away, and that was the one chance they conceded. It would have been a massive sort of gain and haul and contribution, but that happens all the time in football. So, in a way, I guess it's kind of funny that Nico Riley, who was probably close to actually conceding maybe 4 or 5 goals to Everton, gets the sort of same tally as Drought. But of course, O'Reilly was just exceptional once again. I think he had 2 chances early in the first half to probably create maybe 2 assists, I would say, and still had a good shot as well. Bruno, as consistent as ever. There's some news about Cunha and the Brazilian international team, so we'll kind of monitor that. But I think, if you take Cunha out of the season and Ahmad and Bomo are performing the way that they are, not that confident that Bruno's going to hit that record potentially, unless, let's say, Casemiro continues to do what he does, which is possible. But yeah, Bruno has been individually exceptional. Would we like to see a couple more goals from Bruno up until the end of the season? Maybe even a penalty? Of course we would. But yeah, just an amazing FPL pick as well. So that's kind of how I feel about my team with Semenyo. As you guys know, I've already done Semenyo to Turkey. I'm very confident about that transfer, and I won't regret it, because I think, yes, there's the narrative of what happens if City's season kind of ends in Gameweek 37, 38. Like, what does that mean? I still don't see necessarily why that would mean that Turkey's minutes are worse than Semenyo's. Right now, they're not at all. It's kind of the inverse scenario. City, at this moment in time, still have to continue to fight for goals, which will probably also mean that Turkey gets to stay on the pitch a bit longer. And you're seeing that Pep is comfortable, I guess, subbing Semenyo off now, compared to, let's say, 2 months ago, where he pretty much could have played in any position because they had so many kind of injuries in different spots. Or let's say they didn't have 4 almost attacking spots afforded to players like, Turkey and even Doku, right, who was injured for a long time. So now I feel very much happy about that Semenyo to Turkey transfer, because you're kind of moving a player that, in my view, has better baselines. I actually ran the What We've Learned series around Game Week 32. And we kind of had a look at if all the players were going to have equal minutes, or if you look at their per 90s, Turkey was far ahead of Semenyo in terms of just that. And the big thing that Turkey has as an additional boost is that he does take set pieces, which also means usually kind of marries up to situations where he would get additional bonus, or even just, we've seen it this season. Plenty of kind of set piece assists this season are kind of low XA opportunities, but I think the sheer volume of you being a set piece taker usually does mean that you can overperform in that point of view, especially with a fantasy assist system in place, right? So, for example, in a real football game, if a defender, let's say, intercepts a ball off of your corner and then your player scores a rebound effectively, that's a fantasy assist. But in real football, that's just not an assist. So there's no XA for that in real football. But from a fantasy perspective, there's still XA. Technically, you get that XA as the set piece creator. So that's something that I think people are missing out a little bit when they're thinking about, okay, just underlying stats. In fact, if anything, if you're a set piece taker, you should almost artificially boost that XA that a certain player has. But that's kind of my takeover. And my team, I'm pretty happy with this week. And let's move on to the data recap of Game Week 36. So from a data perspective, looking at the bookmaking odds and kind of trying to inform, my transfers, I pretty much look at the odds and think, okay, this is an exceptional game for Brighton, but it's very hard to kind of invest into Brighton this week within the midfield, because I do think that there's probably a little bit more juice coming from, let's say, the direction of maybe just targeting Arsenal over what you will know to be, let's say, a Burnley at home game as well. And then possibly, let's say, I guess, Palace rolling over for them in Gameweek 38, if that game even matters for Arsenal. So, of course, single transfers for Brighton make a lot of sense. So, from that perspective, I think Welbeck is a fantastic transfer for a lot of people who might even consider something like DCL to Welbeck. Now, with João Pedro to Welbeck, I think that kind of move is not exactly the best, because I do think that João Pedro is fantastic for Game Week 37. And even actually, when you look at the Liverpool game here this week, it's quite surprising that despite Chelsea being away and despite Chelsea showing shocking form, why Chelsea still have reasonably good XG for the week. Like, for example, if I just look at all the other teams that have less XG than Chelsea, I mean, Wolves, Sunderland, Brentford, Burnley, Everton, Palace, Forest is close, Newcastle is close, West Ham's lower, and Leeds are lower as well. So there's actually a fair bit of teams that are still expected to do worse than Chelsea in terms of like what the creation of the attack is, despite Chelsea's sort of recent issues. I think that the biggest thing actually that people might be missing here is Liverpool have actually been a really poor defense. And what's probably informing the change in the odds here is not that the markets have not picked up on Chelsea being awful, but rather actually the markets have also picked up similarly that Liverpool have been really poor in defense. So in the last two away matches they played, I think they conceded north of 2xG. And even in their home matches, they've tended to give in their opponents, more than 1xG per game. So that kind of narrative, I suppose, that we had at the let's say middle to the beginning of the season, where Liverpool were probably the third best defense in the league, when we look at XGC, that's kind of slipped away a little bit as of recent weeks. And I do think that maybe that's an element of Liverpool are sort of beached, because yes, they're sort of maximizing for a Champions League spot, but they're very much close to there now, and they're still struggling to get that done. So just an interesting thought for anyone who wanted to keep, let's say, a Chelsea player for this week. Now, obviously, as I said, in terms of single games to target, City is amazing. And I do think when you look at things like this, where City actually have some really good fixtures, the only thing I can really say is that the advantage of owning City is not just for example, the fact that you're buying into the best attacking team in the league that we have, I guess, so far for the rest of the season projected. But also, as I said, just the idea that you're flipping what could be 3 games, let's say minimum, but 4 games maximum. Whereas any other transfer that you make now could very much be, let's say, a 1 to 2 game punt, depending on, where that team is going to be situated in Game Week 38, because the Premier League table can move very, very quickly. And of course, the narrative of who's on the beach will be set in stone in 38. And a lot of teams, let's be honest, could just be on the beach. So the advantage, I think, of actually playing into more City is just the idea that actually you get more bites of the lottery. That's always been my point of view this week, and I still think I hold that view. Otherwise, I think it's very interesting to see, of course, how the markets have adjusted to, let's say, teams like Aston Villa, teams like, let's say, even Crystal Palace after their sort of recent drop-offs in terms of performances. So something to think about there. Aston Villa are playing a team like Burnley, and they still don't have an XG above 2. That's kind of poor. I know this is obviously away from home, and Villa obviously would have finished their game, or their tie, rather, versus Nottingham Forest in the European games. But that's not that impressive, I guess, given how easy Burnley has made it for their opponents, in recent games to kind of score versus them. Elsewhere, I would probably mention that Fulham versus Bournemouth is quite an interesting game, because as good as Fulham have been, Bournemouth have been exceptional too. And it's interesting to see that the markets are sort of pricing, let's say a team like, let's say, Bournemouth, as being basically level opponents to Fulham. Now, it's not an exceptional game for Bournemouth. Like, for example, Crystal Palace last week was much, much better in terms of both the clean sheet percentages and even, let's say, the projected goals that they're going to get. But it just shows you, I think, that that's starting to be priced in now with the markets, with Bournemouth's form. And it makes making a decision this week for, let's say, who to bench quite difficult, because I think I'm quite interested in, is there an opportunity for me to play someone like Senesi, who just seems like he has such a strong floor all the time? Or do I still actually play maybe a Bournemouth attacker, right, where they could probably benefit from actually quite a lot of the kind of predicted goals that we have for this game alone? So that's kind of my last thought. And I think probably the closing thought because a lot of people will know to sort of just go more into Arsenal players, more into City players, maybe rejigging with City, maybe potentially a Brighton player if the transfer makes sense. As I said, a Welbeck, a one-off Welbeck, or even a one-off Hinchelwood could make a lot of sense. But Tottenham is another team that I think that is worth shouting out, especially from a defensive point of view. So when we look at the clean sheet odds this week, Brighton are obviously exceptionally high. So is City, so is Villa, so is Arsenal. And Arsenal, obviously, this is one of the worst weeks that they've had in recent memory in terms of clean sheet odds. So that's actually quite low for their standards. United reasonably high as well, just because Sunderland's attack is not great. But Tottenham are actually showing quite high up versus a very competent team versus Leeds, and I do think that that's a little bit of the market sort of pricing the recent sort of success of Tottenham. But they do also have another great home game in Game Week 38, which will probably be still quite important to them, unless of course West Ham and Tottenham's results make it such that Game Week 38 doesn't matter so much for Tottenham. But something to keep an open eye to, that the transfer in of, let's say, a Tottenham player, which includes even Richarlison, right? So from the perspective of, if you look at someone like Welbeck as a good transfer option, he's a great fixture in Game Week 36. Also, on paper, a great fixture in Game Week 38, where United could be beached. The same logic can be sort of applied towards a Tottenham transfer. So something to think about there. And that's pretty much my sort of recap of the data this week. And a lot of these games tend to have quite high XG. Like, I think a lot of the teams that we brought in from the wildcard 32, like a Bournemouth, for example, they still have extremely high XG despite being away from home. Even Chelsea, as I said, for their actual standards, that seems unusually high this week versus what should be a strong team in Liverpool. And then, of course, the board's really great single games from Brighton, City versus Brentford, and then Arsenal. So that's kind of my thoughts. So with that recap, let's just jump into my team selection for Game Week 36. I plan to actually play a 3-5-2. Part of this, as I said, is because I'm feeling quite confident, I suppose, in the decent sort of baseline of XG for a lot of my players. And it is a bit regretful because I do think that that's going to mean Senesi's on the bench, and Senesi's been an amazing player for me as of recent weeks. But I still have maybe one decision to make, I guess, in terms of who to bench. For defense, I'll pay Verbruggen and Van Heck. That's pretty obvious just with the extremely high clean sheet odds for Brighton. And yeah, I mean, Wolves, to be honest, have been an extremely non-threatening team as of late. They did score for Sunderland recently, but that's probably also prompted, I suppose, by the red card in that game. So yeah, I'd love to play that team there. An interesting argument, I guess, in terms of people who are looking at, having these two players and then maybe also thinking about whether they move towards the luxury free transfer to Palace players. I really just don't think it's worth it. Even for the luxury free transfer point of view, I can totally see you wanting to play maybe a Lacroix over, let's say, if you don't have Gabriel this week, or you have, let's say, a third defender who's a little bit worse than Van Heck or Gabriel. I can totally see the vision to go for Lacroix. But certainly for defense, I think if you have something like the defense that I have, like in terms of O'Reilly, an Arsenal player, plus let's say a Brighton player, not sure if you necessarily need to push to Lacroix. Now, of course, Lacroix could also change the way that you change your lineup. So, for example, you could be playing a 4-4-2 this week, or let's say a 5-3-2 this week, if you wanted to just prioritize playing some of the defenders, and you do think that Lacroix can marginally improve your team for this week. But as I always tend to say recently with the Palace players and sort of our pessimistic view on them, it seems like Riyad actually is fine based on the latest quotes that I'm reading, as reported by Bobby Manzi, who's one of the better Crystal Palace journalists out there. The main thing is that in 37-38, you might want to still make additional free transfers. So saving up, let's say, a few free transfers for a team, or even teams that might have, two good fixtures in hand, or even three fixtures generally that are quite good. Like, for example, Everton makes a lot of sense, right? For example, say you go for, let's say, a Michael Keane this week. It could work out quite well for you over the next few weeks. Say you go for someone like Njai. It could work out for you quite well over the next 3 weeks. So something to keep in mind in terms of the Palace transfers. But I do think Lacroix is probably the best one if you are searching for one. In the midfield, I am planning to play Cole Palmer. We're planning to play Bruno, Tavernier, Cherki, and Saka. The biggest decision for me this game week is actually whether I play Tavernier or Senesi. As I kind of mentioned at the start of this episode, sort of looking at the Game Week 35 team that I had, Tavernier has obviously been pretty disappointing as of late. And if you look at sort of recent results, obviously you would want to play Senesi over Tavernier. But his underlying stats are still really good. He still takes set pieces for the team. This is a game where Bournemouth's clean sheet odds are not particularly good. So I do think that the sort of ceiling for Senesi, I suppose, is not that high as per usual. And so I am kind of inclined to play Tavernier at this moment in time. It's very possible that by the deadline, my last decision is going to be whether I play Senesi or Tavernier. And I think both are very, very solid and fine picks and plays. The reason why I'm backing Palmer and still playing him is, end of the day, he is still, a guaranteed penalty taker. I also had the opportunity to go from Enzo to Saka with the sort of team value that I had. So I've taken this decision specifically to be able to keep Palmer in my team. Now, obviously, I could regret it. And sure, anyone can say that, just watching football, I guess, over the last year, or effectively, since the Club World Cup and maybe that injury around that West Ham game in Gameweek 2, where he was sort of taken off the lineup. Yeah, Palmer has had an exceptionally poor season. The underlying stats have dropped off, even from last season, where people have already sort of markedly noticed, I guess, a bit of a drop off from Palmer. But his underlying stats still alone, even with this really poor season, are still much better when I kind of add in the penalties and the expected minutes that I'm going to get from him compared to Enzo. So for that reason alone, I'm just going to keep Palmer and go for him as a differential. I think a lot of people are selling Palmer this week. I don't think that's a bad move. Certainly, I would have considered Palmer to Saka. In fact, it's one of the moves that I considered within my own transfer plans. But the opportunity, I guess, to do Enzo to Saka was a bit more enticing to me. Just in terms of what my team could look like in Gameweek 37 versus Tottenham and what my team could look like in Gameweek 38 versus Sunderland away. So I'm planning to keep my Chelsea players. Or at least 2 out of 3 of them. We're going to go over Saka here. I just think, yes, there's like conflicting reports in terms of Saka. Like Arteta's mentioned that the pain is gone. Henri's mentioned that he's been managing sort of an Achilles tendon injury, and that's been really tough for him, and that he didn't even train too much before the Atleti game. But all in all, I just think that this is an opportunity to simply go against a little bit of the grain here. I think most people are sort of converging into more Arsenal defenders. I already have Gabriel in place, and certainly I could have gone for more Arsenal defenders this week, but I do really like Senesi still. In fact, I kind of view Senesi as quite a good play for Gameweek 38. And so I see slightly more marginal gains by just going for an attacking upgrade in terms of Enzo to Saka. Now, Saka might not be a 90-minute player for the rest of the season. In fact, I think that's rather unlikely. But 60 to 70 minutes to Saka might just be good enough for me to consider making that move. And I really think that he's going to play really good minutes versus West Ham. I'm happy to be wrong here, but that's just my general conviction. Something to sort of mention too with regards to Saka is if you kind of look at the rest profile, 45 minutes versus Fulham, then there's a 2-day rest, and then you've got Atleti. Plays 57 minutes there. I guess sometimes it might be over ambitious, but you've got 4-day rest here. And I think that that's an opportunity for him to quite easily clear the 60-point margin. And so if he can do that, and let's say the game is still in doubt, I certainly think he plays way more than 70 minutes. If the game is not in doubt, and for example, they have quite a nice lead versus West Ham, I can easily see Saka being taken off. But that's sort of my view on things. So I'm going with Saka here to close out the rest of the season. He'll be, my second Arsenal player. This also means that I'm very locked in terms of budget. And that's also why, for example, at the top of the screen, you'll see that I have taken my free transfers off. I've also shown that my in the bank value is 0.1. So that means that the last free transfer that I possibly have, if I am going to go for an Arsenal player and to triple up on Arsenal for Gameweek 37, is going to be something like Senesi into White. And now, of course, that makes me lose Senesi, but I think that does give me a player who I think for sure is going to play Gameweek 37. I think if you look at Timber, he's been out now for possibly 2 months. I find it really hard to believe that Timber is going to be the player that Arsenal are rushing in to play. White had one of his best games of football recently versus Atleti, and I really do think that he's going to play the rest of the season as the starting right back for this Arsenal team, including the Champions League final. Some people might disagree, but that's just my personal opinion. I think you kind of have to play what you have, and it really does help, of course, that White has played really well as of late. So that's the transfer that I have. Equally, I suppose, worst case scenario, if I really wanted to get out of one of my other players, there's always an opportunity for me to maybe go, I don't know, let's say out of a Palmer for an Arsenal midfielder as well. But there's also, other options too in terms of, what's interesting for Gameweek 37, 38. My midfield still looks a little bit light in terms of Tavernier might not have the best fixtures in 37 and 38. So there's an opportunity there to kind of move around. There's also certainly an opportunity to, maybe even go the other way around, right? Back a team like Bournemouth and then do something like Calvert-Lewin to Krupi if for whatever reason I feel really confident about them. But that's unlikely going to happen. I'm most likely going to roll in Gameweek 37, based on sort of what I'm expecting, but maybe also make that White transfer if I feel like I could take that additional step. And then on Gameweek 38, it's going to be one free transfer territory. But we have plenty of options in FPL. And I think that the biggest thing for Gameweek 38 that some people need to think about is that's a great opportunity to move into, let's say, someone like Mohamed Salah for his final game for Liverpool. But that is versus a Brentford team that have just been really solid all season long. I don't really see the need to kind of hold 2 free transfers to make sure that I can end the season with Salah. Sure, I have a lot of players right now who might not play great minutes in Game Week 38, but other than maybe Salah, who I think is kind of guaranteed to play that game versus Brentford, I don't feel too, I guess, odd about investing heavily into teams that have a lot to play for. Sorry, on Game Week 36 and 37, and maybe don't on Game Week 38. So, what will be, and we'll just have to leave Game Week 38 to the wayside there. I think sometimes it's really beneficial to kind of invest heavily into a Game Week 38. Sometimes it's not. You know, it is just one game, so it's kind of a flip of a coin compared to now, where, as I said, I'd rather take more rolls out of the dice with some of the transfers that I'm going into now than wait until Game Week 38 and hope it all works out on one game week. So those are my thoughts in terms of the team. In terms of the front line, I'm going to play João Pedro and Haaland. Now, on captaincy, I find this quite interesting as an argument, because I do think that all the City players are on the table as captaincy options. With Cherki, I think it's a bit difficult to say that Cherki is like a much better captaincy option than Haaland, because I do think that most of the kind of scenarios where, let's say, Cherki does well as a player, you'd also expect, generally speaking, that those would be aligned to, let's say, situations and circumstances where Haaland does well. But you could also see it as the opposite, right? So I think Cherki has obviously had some exceptional games. Like, he's also a set piece creator. It's not necessarily the case that Haaland's going to be on the end of those set pieces. And obviously, as an attacker, you don't have such a homogenous way of getting returns as compared to, let's say, two defenders who are very much reliant, for the most part, first of all, getting clean sheets. And then DEFCON is kind of a different thing. But with Nico O'Reilly, I think you have the opposite, where at least whatever the clean sheet odds for City are over the accumulated 2 games, that's something that Cherki can only marginally benefit from, and that's certainly something that Haaland doesn't benefit from at all. So we've seen circumstances like, for example, the Chelsea game, where O'Reilly gets subbed off at around 65 minutes. He can score a goal and get a clean sheet, and Haaland can obviously have no involvement within a game, and you're laughing, right? So I do think most of the outcomes, if you really want to punt against Haaland as a captaincy option, all lead towards, generally speaking, going for O'Reilly here. So my vice captain will definitely be O'Reilly. What would make me hesitant to go against O'Reilly is, I think it is a question of risk, and also just how good is O'Reilly really. So when we look at, let's say, the XGI of, let's say, the last, I don't know, if you kind of look at when City's season changed, and changed specifically, what I mean by that is when they started playing the front four of Semenyo, Cherki, and Doku. If you take that game, include some of the cup matches as well, and you look at the XGI from that point on to now, actually, O'Reilly is not far behind Cherki in XGI. He's not far behind even Haaland in XGI. So even from the attacking point of view, O'Reilly has proven to be just an incredible player. And so I really think that the interesting piece is a lot of models don't predict that sort of same level of production from O'Reilly as he has sustained within recent memory. But that's the beauty of the punt, right? So that's something that might be my second last decision to think about for this game week, given that I've really locked into my moves, and I'm pretty much on an island here with 0.1 in the bank. So O'Reilly is the current vice captain, Haaland is the captain, but you know me, I do like a differential captain at times. Has it worked out for me much this season? To be honest, no, but that doesn't mean that they're bad decisions. I think as long as you can kind of create a canvas where you think, okay, the baselines are there for a punt to go, my direction and my way. And yeah, I'll certainly be thinking about that this week. In terms of my bench order, I'll be going with Darlow, then Senesi, Calvert-Lewin, and Struijk in that order. I do think maybe Calvert-Lewin could be ahead of Senesi, but I guess I'm already marginally backing Bournemouth as a team versus Fulham by playing Tavernier. I wouldn't mind if my auto sub ended up being Senesi. So those are my thoughts in terms of Game Week 36. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys soon for more content.